Thank you, Deputy Chair, and thank you, Honorable Senators, for the opportunity to speak with you all today. As mentioned, my name is Guy Dean, and I'm the CEO for Coastal Nations Fisheries. As you may know, Coastal Nations Fisheries is a groundbreaking 100% Indigenous-owned fishing company and was created to recognize the economic fishing opportunity envisioned from the signing and formalization of the Fisheries Resource Reconciliation Agreement, or what we refer to as the FRRA. Our company is collaboratively owned by 8 nations that are signatories to the FRRA and are comprised of the Haida Nation, Metlakatla First Nation, Kikatla Nation, Gitgat First Nation, Kitasoo Nation, Heiltsuk First Nation, Nuhawk Nation, and the Wikuno Nation. Our work is twofold: to acquire access, including licenses and quota from willing sellers in the open marketplace in order to create and run a coastwide commercial fishing company participating in a multitude of fisheries and species, and to help our shareholder nations in implementing their own community-based fisheries in the waters adjacent to their homes and communities. Our model and goal is to run a fair, successful, profitable business that not only generates jobs for our nation's citizens, but generates profits from our commercial company that are distributed back to our shareholder nations so they can invest back into their communities and create the infrastructure for long-term food security, cultural survival, and economic needs. While the introduction of individual vessel quotas, IVQs, has had a positive effect on sustainable harvesting and maximizing marketability of commercial species harvested on the Pacific Coast, an unintended consequence was the creation of a commoditized trading market where non-fishing speculative investors and offshore ownership of licenses and quota have driven up prices. This license concentration and offshore ownership is threatening our West Coast fishers, our coastal communities, independent fishers, and First Nations in British Columbia. In fact, since 2015, when negotiations for the FRRA began till today, many species licenses and quota values have risen in price by as much as 150%, with some licenses like red sea urchin licenses rising by over 400%. This is because of those groups and individuals that have chosen to use this fishing access as a speculative investment for their portfolio or money sheltering versus actually fishing the asset and bringing value to local economies and the coastal communities that rely on this resource. If left unchecked, this will undermine the economic objectives of the FRA and our organization. Our ability to acquire access with the funds available has already become greatly diminished. Now, rest assured, our company is taking great efforts to not contribute to increasing prices ourselves through our own acquisition process, but it has impacted our ability to provide enough access to support our nation's citizens and our company. As an example, we focus our procurement strategy on those priority species important to our shareholder nations, which are harvested close to their communities. Spot prawns are one of those desired species, but for the past few years, we've had limited success acquiring those licenses as speculators have pushed prices up to levels that have been unsustainable, raising prices by 64%. Instead of fishing these licenses themselves, these speculators have been able to charge high lease values with little benefit back to those who actually harvest and fish the prawns in the communities they live in. Moreover, what is increasingly disturbing is the unregulated competition and lack of controls for licenses and quota in BC that allows anyone in the world access to this Canadian Pacific resource. It is our opinion that for us to have vibrant commercial fisheries that benefit working harvesters and First Nations, we need a made in BC owner-operator fleet separation policy that moves into regulation. While we acknowledge the positive benefits that the Atlantic Canada fisheries have experienced through fleet separation and owner-operator policies, we are also conscious that some of our fisheries and how they operate are unique on the Pacific Coast, and we need a made in BC model to ensure everyone is treated fairly. Tools such as license and quota registries, fair leasing policies, supplier agreements, and extended transition timelines all may need to be taken into consideration for the successful implementation of an owner-operator policy here in BC. Yet those are simply tools to help to reach a desired outcome. What is clear to us is an owner-operator regime could help both reduce the inflated market value for licenses and quota over time and allow all coastal nations and independent fishermen more affordable access to licenses and quota, while creating vibrant coastal communities that share in the economic benefit of the fisheries they participate in. Finally, I'd like to provide a personal perspective. We've heard some concern of the potential impact the implementation of an owner-operator policy may have on those processors who currently own access to this resource. Having started in this industry as a deckhand in my late teens, working as a commercial diver in my early 20s, and subsequently working my way through the industry from harvester, processor, wholesaler, and distributor, I spent over 40 years in the industry. The processors that I know treat their fishers fairly, create jobs in communities up and down the coast, and keep supporting the local economy. Their concern is in ensuring that they can maintain supply so there is economic benefit, not just for their organization, but for the coastal communities they work and live in. Through effective supply chain agreements and a multi-year transition plan to owner-operator regulation, I believe their concerns can and will be addressed. Not just confined to Atlantic Canada, we've seen the owner-operator model implemented successfully in Alaska with little impact to those processors actively involved in the industry, who are committed to the long-term viability of the industry for all. We believe that to support an enduring, effective industry, vibrant coastal economies, and successful ongoing Indigenous reconciliation, the benefits of seafood harvested within BC's commercial fisheries needs to flow through working harvesters, First Nations, and the coastal communities we live and work in. And for that to happen, policy needs to change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dean. We'll move on now, please, to Mr. Russ. Trevor Russ, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon or good evening to you all. Madam Chair and members of the Standing Senate Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. My name is Trevor Russ. I am the Director of Policy and Programs for the Great Bear Initiative Society, better known as Coastal First Nations. I am also a member of the Haida Nation and have been a fisherman my entire life. I have participated in federally regulated fisheries in the past and continue to fish under my rights to provide food for my family, friends, and community. I appreciate the opportunity and the invitation to speak with you today as part of your study on commercial fisheries licensing regime on Canada's Pacific Coast. Our organization is an alliance of nations from the North Pacific Coast that include Gitga'at, Gitxaala, Haida, Hiltzik, Kitasoo, Hehe, Metlakatla, Newhalk, and Wekino nations, whose territories include over 40% of marine waters and coastline on the Pacific Coast. For the past 25 years, our member nations have been working together, nation to nation, with federal and provincial governments on land and marine policy issues, including fisheries. The Great Bear Initiative Society, Coastal First Nations, oversees the implementation of many negotiated agreements between our member nations and the Crown, including the Fisheries Resource Reconciliation Agreement, FRA, that was mentioned. A transformative agreement itself signed by our member nations and the Government of Canada in 2021, which commits our member nations in Canada to the collaborative governance and management of fish habitat, and fisheries, and included financial resources to support increased access to federally regulated commercial fisheries. With the support of our board of directors, who are the elected leaders of our member nations, we have engaged with other First Nations and industry partners to develop options for a Made in BC approach to license policy reform that supports an owner-operator model and First Nations-owned access to federally regulated fisheries. In 2022, a letter was sent to then Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, Honorable Joyce Murray, and Premier of BC, David Eby, from our leadership, indicating our member nation's willingness to work with the Crown to develop a Made in BC approach to license policy reform in BC. In 2024, a letter was sent from Premier Eby to then Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, Honorable Diane Labouthier, expressing the need to move forward with a Made in BC approach to license reform. The current federally regulated licensing policy in Canada's Pacific does not support coastal communities and working harvesters. It undermines efforts to sustain and build viable fishing enterprises and rewarding careers for residents of the coast. With the current licensing policy, community access to wealth generated from adjacent waters is greatly limited, making efforts by First Nations communities, local and provincial governments to build thriving, resilient communities even more challenging. It also greatly impedes the ability to fully realize the goals of resource reconciliation agreements between First Nations and Canada. In Section 2.5 of Canada's new Fisheries Act, it calls for, among other key considerations in decision-making, consideration of social, economic, and cultural factors in the management of fisheries. In Atlantic Canada, licensing policies are developed to protect the interest of coastal communities and independent harvesting enterprises, and in doing so, strengthen socioeconomic and cultural outcomes. These policies have recently been put into regulation to further ensure that in Atlantic Canada, First Nations, coastal communities, and independent harvesters are primary recipients of the economic and social benefits derived from harvesting seafood. The same protective measures and policy and regulations need to be put into place in BC. We're committed to working together to ensure that the benefits generated from commercial fishing in the North Pacific coast stay with First Nations, working fish harvesters, and adjacent communities, contributing to resilience, prosperity, and well-being of our coast and province. Thank you again for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Russ. Mr. Wright, you now have the floor with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Howie Wright. I'm from the Gitxsan Nation up in the northwestern BC on the Skeena River. And I've been working with Ha'oom Fisheries Society since April of 2022. Ha'oom Fisheries Society is the group that implements the rights-based fisheries for the 5 nations that went to court starting in 2003 and ending in 2021 through the BC Court of Appeal that constitutionally protected their Aboriginal rights to harvest and sell fish in their territories upwards to 9 nautical miles. After that, the nations signed a reconciliation agreement with the government to start implementing those rights. Since then, it's been a combination of implementation through the Ha'oom Fisheries Society and negotiations to a final reconciliation agreement with the nations. Part of that involves the involvement of mitigation and purchasing of licenses to implement through the nation's rights-based fishery. The nations have signed through their reconciliation agreement, a community-based fishery to implement on the converting commercial licenses. And within those, we've experienced the how regular commercial licenses are used, and I'll spend the rest of the time commenting on how fisheries modernization can help improve those processes and recognizing the relationship between the nation's rights-based fisheries, but also within the commercial, regular commercial fishery there. I think you also recognize the nation's fish from the town of Tofino up north to Zapalos on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And the nations are Hausut Nation, Tahlequah First Nation, Heshquit First Nation, Moachat Muchalat First Nation, and Ihatasat Chiniktak First Nation. A lot of the decisions that DFO has made in the past have concentrated the salmon fishery in the hands of processors and investors, having rules created to treat fish as a commodity to be bought, sold, and leased, opposed to a source of food security to benefit small-scale fisheries. In the context of fisheries allocation, we need to protect the access rights of traditional fishing communities from industrial fishing and to control private actors that affect the lands, territories, and waters on which these communities depend upon. The nations do support the development of a Pacific owner-operator style of regulation for the fisheries. We need to focus on active fishers, not armchair or inactive license holders. Corporations, other than personal corporations for tax purposes, including foreign ownership, should not be able to buy licenses and quota in BC. We also don't agree with vessel size restrictions in the fleet as you move towards transfers of licenses. Also, for the nations, we do not agree on one license per species. For the nations, we'd like to see a special license for all the species as authorized by the Ha'oom, the hereditary governance of the Nuchanoth Nation. We should also look at permitting and separating of stacked or married licenses for sale by the license owner and giving the opportunity to divest some or all of their licenses to promote and facilitate existing harvesters and new entrants to become owner operators. We should have a moratorium right now on the further introductions of individual property right regimes, such as individual fishing quotas. I believe that we could have an undertaking of a licensing review and within 2 years, look at having for the 5 nations their own taquiac licensing, removing of some of the vessel gear and length restrictions where they have not been proven to achieve conservation objectives, and ensure that licenses are not owned or controlled by processors, investors, and have a timeline that can look at moving any of those for sale, similar to what was done on the East Coast. Commercial fisheries contribute to food security for First Nations through 2 pathways: directly by providing fish for people, especially low-income consumers, to eat, and thereby improving both food availability and adequacy for safe, clean diets; indirectly by generating income for the fishery sector of Indigenous nations. Thanks.